capturing the meaning, which is really about really getting a better understanding of the meaning of their life, their lived experience. So taking those basic themes and then elevating it and providing a deeper understanding of what the children were going through. Did I miss you with anything?
No, got exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. Oops.
And so these are our main categories that we found. So the knowledge of the coronavirus and advice to an alien, effects on rights to education, play and association, children's responses to the pandemic, which it's important to note that we specifically asked children what they thought their jobs were during the pandemic and what they believe their extent was when in the role that they played. And then their awareness of rights. So as I mentioned previously, this was the first photo that we showed our participants when doing the interviews. Initially, I wasn't quite sure when Donna had mentioned this photo. I don't know if they'll know, it might be scary, but every single child knew that this was the coronavirus. And so some of our responses, the corona ball, it's COVID-19, and the coronavirus thingy. Along with this, children had also mentioned that they were aware of death and dying. And this was not something that we mentioned or brought up in conversation. It was actually them who brought it up. We had an 8-year-old who said, it killed a bunch of people. And so when children brought up death, we asked, does everyone get sick and die, or is it certain people? And some of the participants were able to say that certain populations were more at risk. Like this 12-year-old who said some infants and seniors are more at risk because they have a more compromised immune system. One of the questions we asked during the interview was, if an alien came to Earth and didn't know anything about the coronavirus, what would you tell them? And this question was important because we used it to determine what children thought was the most important thing about the pandemic. And so some of the responses were, I would tell them in alien language that we're a mess, there's corona here. And then we also had someone else say, stay 2 meters away from people you don't know, do not get sick, and go back to your planet. So when we discussed education, most children preferred in-person learning rather than online. They found online learning was difficult, and they had challenges with concentration, technology, and they really wanted to see their friends in person. There were some participants who preferred online learning, their reasoning being that they felt safer at home and that there was a less risk of them contracting the virus. And there was also more flexibility. There was one participant who said that he could type really fast on the computer, so he could finish his homework faster, and he had more time to play. There was also this notion of a lesser education. So many children believed that the online learning did not produce the same quality of learning, and many of children were frustrated by it. They felt that they were experiencing a loss in their learning. So when we spoke to children about play, we realized that the activities that they usually played were no longer feasible, but they were able to make adaptations to their play, such as using Zoom or online gaming, but they really found themselves playing alone most of the time. And we have some quotes here that mention that. And so this sense of isolation was very profound. There was a lot of attention put on touching others. And so the acknowledgement of the loss of activities that provide touch and physical contact were mentioned often, such as hide and seek and tag. And so when we asked children, how do you feel and what is it like? There were a lot of negative emotions that were brought up. Mostly fear and sadness, fear of contracting the virus, or fear that someone they love would catch the virus and die. And then sadness that they're being isolated away from their friends and most of their family. There were some positive comments made about the pandemic, such as being able to spend more time with family at home and also spending time with pets.
And so looking at adaptations to daily living does sort of link up with rights, because there had to be changes made based on all the stuff that was going on. And play adaptations were most notable. And we looked closely at that because we were looking at the right to play. And I talked to one 10-year-old boy who loved soccer. And I was trying to figure out how he's playing soccer by himself. And so he lived in an apartment in Toronto. He had to go downstairs to a field. There was no park. And so he would use a fence and aim for the target. And he would he'd tell himself to shoot and then try to hit the target. And then when he had no soccer cones, he took some butter bowls from the kitchen and put them down in the field. And then he would dribble the ball around the bowls. So the improvisations that children were doing because they could not play with their friends or play a team sport was absolutely profound. And again, you would not get this kind of information if you used a survey. You would never get at the story of what the child had to do in order to make it happen, right? And again, this notion of hide and seek and not being able to play and having to find a way to make it happen was so inspiring that, some kids sought to create a hide and seek game that was an online version where the person would be shrunk and they would have to move around big pieces of furniture in order to hide, as an example. And other children took up different activities that they maybe normally wouldn't do, like this 12-year-old girl who said she took up painting because it made her feel more at peace. But overwhelmingly, it was this notion of hide and seek and what it meant not to play hide and seek and what it meant to then adapt and make it happen was, I think, one of the most profound pieces of data from this study. And so moving on to shared responsibility, one of the things that I always ask children whenever I do a study with them is, what do you think your job is? Do you have a job? And I don't do it in the sphere of rights and responsibilities, because I know that's a controversial area. We don't want children to feel like they have to be responsible in order to get a right. We know that rights are standalone and they're always there regardless. But I do think it's important to ask children if they think they have a job and what might it be. And I find that now during the pandemic, it's probably one of the best questions that we can ask children, because it forces them to reflect on their role in society, on their role in a democracy too, right? So of course, all of the children said they had jobs. There wasn't one child that said, we're going to leave it up to the grown-ups. We're not going to worry about this. So again, and I've seen this happen in previous studies I've done when SARS was here in Toronto. Kids had the same response. And here's a 7-year-old whose teacher was pregnant and told us that even though he didn't want to wear the mask, he did not take it off because that meant something to him. And there was a shared responsibility to keep everybody safe. Additional quotes from that particular category, this recognition that one infection, so you screw up, it's going to have an impact on everybody else. And realizing that we have to depend on one another. So this notion of collectivism, again, children have inherently. And so this is why, again, it's important for us to ask them, what do they think they need to do? Is there something that they believe they can do as children? And there were also a lot of, collectivist thinking around social justice issues. Children talked about poverty in the world. They felt bad for the people that lost their jobs during COVID. They believed that grocery store workers should get more money and that the government should help them out. They even talked about single parent families and the impact that COVID-19 had on single parent families. And then we asked kids, do you know if you have rights at this time? Do you even understand that children have rights? And it was a little bit less than half of the kids, that were aware of rights. So, every time this comes up, I always think we have so much more work to do in terms of education and how children understand their rights. But when we did have discussions with it, children were able to sort of understand the value of a particular right. So this 10-year-old boy said, school gives them an education and play makes them have fun and be happy. And he also added that if you don't have these things, you could be sad and nobody wants to be sad. So there's an acknowledgement or an understanding that the knowledge around children's rights is also indicative of children's well-being, right? And we talked about the children not being able to get together. There was one 8-year-old who said it's not fair, because kids want to meet each other. And so that was another sort of real awareness of not only a right, but a need. They had a real need to make this happen. And this was not happening during the lockdowns, particularly here in Ontario, Canada, where there was just there were a lot of lockdowns, lots of schools.
I'm going to, I was planning on leaving.
And then to move on to more specific rights around information and participation, there was an inherent understanding that we need to tell everybody. We need to have everybody understand. And even though it's scary, we need to understand how to make this better so we're more careful, right? And we're more safe. And then if children didn't know about the virus and how it's contracted, it would be a mess. And this is coming from a 7-year-old. I hope I'm not moving too fast. I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. And then again, and I've seen this happen in other research I've done, the older kids are very much aware that the younger kids need to understand too. And so there isn't this notion that, well, no, it's because I'm bigger now that we don't need to tell young kids. So they understand that they may not understand everything, but that still need to know. And this quote was a little bit humorous because the acknowledgement of the snotty noses, right, when they get sick. And so from a safety point of view, they should know what's going on. And that's really significant because young children are often marginalized from the discussion and they're not given opportunities to understand what's going on around them. But yet they're picking up the anxiety and the stress from the people in their families, in their worlds. So this takes us to the final interpretation, which is really the hermeneutical or the upper level analyses that we did taken from the data. And what we know everyone is affected by the pandemic, but that children have a lot less control over their lives than adults. And that really should be our sort of starting point in understanding what our adult response should be to them, right? And so we came up with this notion, and this has been, cited in the literature before, that children have to coexist in the adult world and in the child's world. And in this case, the data revealed that this involves a lot of hiding and seeking in a pandemic. And so I found this visual and I thought this kind of captures it for us, because the world has been literally consumed and held hostage by this virus. And so we're having to navigate, our regular worlds, but also the world of the pandemic. And thinking about the exhaustion that brings on, not only for children, but of course for adults as well. So even though children were largely unaware of their rights, they had to figure out how to coexist in both worlds, and having an appreciation for what that means, I think it's really important. And this brings us, into a closer analysis of the hiding and the seeking. And Donald Winnicott, the famous British pediatric psychiatrist, talks a lot about the sort of seeing me, seeing you, the joint attention, all of those facets of what makes hiding and seeking so powerful. And in this case, you know, he says, it is a joy to be hidden and disaster not to be found. And that this particular activity is integral in promoting development, promoting trust building, promoting relationships between children and adults and between children and children. And Camilla Grossi was a therapeutic clown at the Hospital for Sick Children. She was an amazing clown, and she wrote this book a few years ago and really acknowledged hiding and seeking as a traditional game of childhood. And so it's not just a regular activity, it has bigger meaning. And the fact that this is a game that's been played for thousands of years. And the whole process of hiding and seeking really begins with peekaboo, right? So the child sees the other person and the other person sees the child. And there's this hiding and this discovery when you're found and you're recognized, right? And so this has a universal meaning for everybody. The other thing about hiding and seeking, it happens everywhere in the world. There's no place on this earth where children do not hide and seek, right? So it goes over any sort of cultural boundaries or geographical boundaries. And so children, even regardless of gender, engage in this type of play. So historically, in earlier anthropological studies, all of these things were revealed to be true. Because for children, when they're playing hide and seek, there's nothing worse than hearing the game go around you and nobody caring enough to come and find you. So that acknowledgement of personhood and identity is so powerfully linked to what we saw here in our data. So if we use hiding and seeking as a metaphor, you know, we can see in all the different ways it emerged from the data. So they had to adapt the play. So they created an online version. They play other games that were similar to hide and seek on the computer with their friends. There was also the emotional piece, right? Not being able to touch, see your friends, which created, as Max said earlier, a fair degree of sadness, probably the most profound element of the emotional piece. And then just basically a denial of the right to play the way you want to play. So they were essentially prevented from participating in that existential dilemma of being lost and found. So children were basically competent in the two worlds. Children in their world are going to continue to seek. They're going to continue to explore. They're going to continue to examine and learn from the environment, from the people around them. And we saw that this happened in all aspects of their life. On the flip side of that, in the other world, which is the adult world, children had to isolate. They had to hide. They had to comply with public health policies. They had to listen to the adults. But they did so in a way where they accepted responsibility for keeping everybody safe. And they were also really sensitive to social justice issues. And we did not ask them about that. They brought that up spontaneously. And there is, at the end of the presentation, there is a list of references of other scholars who have discussed children's coexistence in two worlds. And it was nice to see that it came here, it sort of emanated from the data as well.
So we know that children's rights are often superseded by public health needs. And in regards to this pandemic, the right to play, association, and education was really not a top priority. And these are similar findings to those that were found during the SARS outbreak, which was years ago. So it doesn't really look like we've made much progress in regards to protecting children's rights. There were a lot of challenges associated with our recruitment, especially during the pandemic. We could not meet the families and the children and build any sort of rapport with them in order to get them to join our study. And so we really had to depend on the relationship that the pediatricians had with them. Along with that, since we were in lockdown, any conversations that were had were either over the phone or through email. And so initially we had almost 100 participants interested in joining, but it ended up being the 20 just because we couldn't do follow-ups and stuff like that. And so when we look at our design choice and the method that we used of doing interviews, knowing that it would be more difficult to interview children online, why not just use an online survey? It might just be easier. We wanted to really hear the perspectives of the children and dig deeper into what they were saying. If you do an online interview, an online survey, it really limits the depth of understanding, and it also marginalizes some children who don't have access to internet or might have a disability. We also had some ethical dilemmas and protection issues. We had to build a level of trust with the parents within the first 5 minutes of meeting them on camera. Keep in mind, a lot of these families had the camera in a public living space where they were sharing it with other members of the family or in a bedroom. So we essentially had a view into their own personal home. So that was something that we had to be very mindful of. Also, families might not have trusted us since we were strangers initially. So we had some parents on camera, which could have caused some issues in regard to how the children responded to some of our questions. So we had to navigate that and politely ask parents to leave in order to have a conversation with the child that wasn't influenced by the presence.
Yeah, well, I think that's, yeah. So the final thoughts that we want to share before we open it up, one of them being, and Max just mentioned this, you know, if we're really thinking about child rights-based ethical research, then we do have to be critical in a constructive way of what we've seen in the last year. So again, lots of large online surveys, which yes, of course, have their merit. I'm not trying to discount the value of that research. But what I also found was that research never gave me a positive outlook in terms of what the children were thinking, because those surveys tend to be designed with questions that produce a certain outcome, that produce a certain type of data. But when you sit down and ask children to tell you stories, then you hear the truth behind a lot of what's going on. And that means good and bad. And so we need to be able to think about, are we really engaging in supporting the child's right to be heard if we're marginalizing some children? And we're also asking questions that are going to lead to particular outcomes, as opposed to giving children more freedom, more opportunities to tell their stories. The other piece that's important here is the analysis. There is a citation by Eakin and Gladstone on the reference list where they talk about value added. We need to be able to respect what the children are saying in a way that we give the analysis just as much attention as everything else. And that means sort of taking that data and bringing it up to another level. What is it telling us about how we view children, how we view childhood, how there are all these socially embedded systems that sort of shape childhood, as it were? And we don't get there if we don't do higher level of analyses that get at the meaning, that get at what was it like to be a child living in this pandemic. And I'm encouraging people, ask kids about their jobs. Don't tell them what to do. Ask them what they think they should do. and they're more likely to engage. They're more likely to understand that they're a part of what we're doing. And it's more likely to be that we are going to be encouraging and promoting the child's right to participation. So we should not be afraid to talk about jobs, responsibilities, roles, how they help out. And I really quite committed to that. And then finally, this pandemic has sort of given us an opportunity to think about, you know, is there something that we could have done better as child rights advocates or people that care about children's health or psychosocial health? Are there things that we could have done to make it easier for the children in our communities to enjoy an uninterrupted, as much as possible, childhood? And I think about the Toronto area, I think about the amount of school lockdown closures, the number of playgrounds that were closed. I mean, how can we imagine a better world where children's rights are better recognized even during a pandemic? And those are the thoughts that I leave you with. And Max and I are really excited to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was really interesting. And I think that in the chat, there was a lot of comments about what a wonderful metaphor that was. And I think that really resonated with people. I'm going to open with Kathy's question. So I think I'll read it out loud and we can go from there. I would, again, encourage everybody else, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. Or if you prefer, you can put up the little hand button and raise your hand and we can unmute yourself when it's your turn. So Kathy asks, sorry, now I've scrolled down here. As we move into a phase with vaccines for children, what does your research show about how we approach decision-making about children getting vaccines? And what is the role of children themselves in this phase?
Yeah, we had children talk about vaccines, and of course this data collection occurred before we had vaccines available. So there was a clear indicator there that they understood the power of vaccines and that they were, you know, likely going to be getting them at some point. The only issue for kids, of course, is to think about how to roll that out. And you know, because there are a lot of children who don't want to get needles and obviously, you know, don't want that to happen. So yeah, I don't know, Kathy, because I wonder if we were to interview them now, where there's much more talk about vaccines, whether we would have a better understanding of that. I don't know if I answered your question though.
I think that answered the question. I'm not sure, Kathy, do you have anything to add to that? You're free to unmute yourself if you'd like to.
No, thank you very much. I'm just thinking about the child as actor and the agency of children, and that we move into this phase. I hear a lot of talk about, you know, parents making the decision, and certainly parents have a role, but I'm hoping, you know, against this research and others that we've done, that we find a way to really incorporate children's agency in this next phase somehow.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And the question also becomes, when we were talking about whether to reopen schools or keep them closed, you know, nobody thought about asking the children, you know, who felt comfortable going back and who didn't. And that dialogue never happened. I mean, it was very much a top-down Ministry of Education and parent discussion and teacher discussion versus, you know, what some of the children might have preferred.
I agree, and I hope we might do better in the next phase.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yes.
Hi there, it's Deborah Parks here. Thanks for that presentation. The thing when you talk about children's ideas on whether they should go back on that, of course, you know, we don't want to forget that their ideas are also going to be very influenced by what they hear their parents say, right? So I'm not sure how one sort of gets around that, but just a thought.
Yeah, totally. Did you want to say something?
I think we had some children when asked who should make the decision as to whether they go back to school or not. A lot of children were aware that some children would only want to go back to see their friends. But they were also aware that, you know, even though I want to see my friends, I don't think it's safe to go back yet. So there is that awareness that at least I noticed in some of the interviews.
Yeah, and some of the kids did talk about, you know, we have to listen to the scientists.
Yeah.
There was that acknowledgement that there are people that have greater knowledge. But yes, of course, there's going to be some parental influences there. And I think that was a concern that came up in some of the research I saw, where people were saying that they were accessing children's perspectives. And yet what they really did when you took a close look at the study was they were asking parents about the kids' experiences, and that's just not the same. So that's another sort of critique of some of the research that's currently out there that is talking about children's participation in research, but the children aren't participating.
Right, I appreciate that, and I really enjoy a longer discussion at some point, but I think that really speaks to what children live and children's ability to think. You know, how children think is so influenced by what is going on around them and the adults in their life, and whether the adults allow them. Like if you've got a young, I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning, but if you have a young child saying you got to listen to what the scientists say, I mean, that's not the wording of a young child, right? That's, you know, so exactly. I think, so totally. I'm not sure. Yeah. So I think when rather than sort of say, well, what we need to do is really get at the child's understanding, I'm not sure. It seems to be that's sort of not like, I don't know what you'd call that, a false dichotomy. But in fact, what we need to rather incorporate is the understanding that these children's ideas are highly influenced by what the adults around them are saying. And in what ways are they influenced? And so to me, that would be like, you know, that would maybe be a very different research design. You know, I can think of, for example, you know, somebody, you know, I happen to know who's like, you know, very fundamentalist religion. And, you know, you can be sure that that child, if they were participating in the research, would be talking the language of their parents. And that speaks to, you know, the influences of children and on children. Yeah, I'd be happy to speak longer. It's a really fascinating discussion and aspects. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah.
I'm going to turn it over to Noah and then Jane. So Noah, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Oh, what an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. It was really, really fantastic. I really appreciated it. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the two worlds idea, and whether you saw in your data, you said that you saw that emerging, but whether you saw ways that COVID or maybe children's rights was sort of blending those worlds as well. Like we have this like notion of like children being separate from adulthood, but I think things like COVID really brought home the idea that, well, actually, maybe we're sharing a lot more space than we thought originally.
Yeah, no, nice to see you, Noah.
Really good to see. Yeah, really good to
so, yeah, no, I agree. I think there is a blending, but there's also, I think the burden is still on the children in the sense that they're still trying to navigate because they have less power than the adults.
Right.
They're still navigating two very different worlds at the same time, and they're doing it in an almost covert way. So if you don't ask children what they're doing when they're adapting their play, you would never know that they go to such lengths to adapt and make it happen. And it's actually quite inspiring, but I don't, you know, my sense would be that a lot of parents don't know that their children are doing this, that they're going out to the field and creating an imaginary soccer field, right? I mean, those are the stories that tell us how resilient children are too. And how, despite the fact that many of them don't know they even have a right, they somehow they get it done. They make it happen. And I think that's wonderful, but I also concern that we don't do enough to bring them in. We don't do enough to help them realize those rights. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are my
absolutely thoughts. Yeah, thank you. Really, like as power holders, the onus is on us really to like do major systemic change to make sure that their voices are more present, right? So yeah, thank you so much. Fantastic. Really great to see you.
Thank you, Noah. Nice to see you too.
Over to you, Jane.
Donna. Hi, Max. Just a couple of comments. One was I was struck by the comments from the children that you interviewed, how inundated they were with the information from COVID, like we all were, but I was particularly struck by that. The other theme that struck me too was the challenges of online learning and being separated from those really valuable relationships, and how much research there will be into the future about the impact of the pandemic, and also your the parallels to your research around SARS. That struck me as well, and I think there's probably some really rich findings that you're going to come across into the coming months and years as we move through what this will look like. And I wanted to share just an experience here at Sick Kids with helping siblings to be connected with each other, learning to use families' iPads. I have a family who it's 2 little girls who are siblings who are very close in age. So I would send the mom home with craft materials or activities for the sibling that I knew we would be doing here. And so the siblings would get online onto their iPad with each other and do the activity together, because for weeks they couldn't see each other, and they were really struggling with that separation. So all of us had to learn very quickly how to use Zoom and some of this technology to reach children who didn't have access to each other.
Yeah, really important points, right, to bring home. And you're right, there's a lot of parallels between SARS and what happened now, for sure. I don't know if you wanted to respond to anything. Nice to see you, Jane.
So nice to see you, Jane. And yeah, I guess when you're hospitalized, everything that a child normally experiences is almost like exasperated, right? Because then they really, at Sick Kids right now, siblings aren't allowed. So at least when you're at home, you could have your family. You're isolated, but you're with your family. And in this situation, yeah, the children are just isolated really by themselves. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah, so just the uniqueness of that context, right, of the hospitalized child being that much more profoundly isolated than the rest of the children in the community. So yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Jane.
Rebecca, I think you've had your hand up for a bit. Over to you.
Oh, hey, thank you so much. Thanks, that was a really great presentation. Can you all hear me? I know I'm in this huge auditorium and I'm probably echoing like crazy.
No, it's fine. Thank you, Rebecca.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. It was really great. And I shared with you the concern about people not hearing about children's experiences and their viewpoints in decision making. I was also involved in a project a little bit like yours where we were talking to kids, and so I want to make a comment, and I have a question, and the comment is related to this idea that children sort of are just going to parrot what their parents think. And we actually found that a lot of the kids, that even though they were sort of sectioned off into their families, that they were actually getting a lot of information from a lot of different places, particularly like social media and also through their online schooling. So it wasn't only about the influence of their parent. But anyway, the question that I had is something that we were facing in our own have been facing in our own work, and that's, so we want to highlight children's competence and their resiliency, and it sounds like, that's a lot of what, their creativity, how amazing it is. Well, here I'm doing exactly what I want to problematize. How amazing it is, how they were so creative, how they were so competent. And then I think that is so problematic to frame, because it's like we sound like we're surprised. And I know that we're talking back to a discourse that sort of suggests that children are incompetent or incapable or we're paralyzed or only suffering, which a lot of, the sort of larger scale surveys were suggesting that it was all about suffering. But how do we talk about that without sounding surprised, right? How do we talk about it without seeming like, oh my gosh, look how on the ball these kids are? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear that, and it makes sense. And when we talk about these examples, we do set ourselves up to kind of perpetuating something that we don't want to perpetuate. I think we speak about it in line with what is it that we can do to better support. I mean, if children are doing these covert kind of adaptations to their lives on so many different levels during a pandemic, I think the question comes back to us. And I think we frame it from a perspective that, you know, isn't it great that they're doing this, but they're doing it with very little support. And the onus is on us to make it different next time, or to acknowledge and to do a critical reflection. If you really are a child rights advocate, you know, my view is that we didn't do enough. And so that's kind of the way I'm looking at it. And I totally appreciate your point though, Rebecca. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No,
does that make sense?
That's true.
But yeah, I really respect that point. It makes a lot of sense.
Super. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Olaf?
Yeah, hi Donna, thank you so much.
Hi Olaf, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I've seen pieces of that before, but I really enjoyed seeing it again. And I just want to get your opinion or your feeling about what might happen in the future. So these kids, let's say, how will they act as adults in 10 years from now? What do you think was the impact of that experience and the realization of them, what they can do and how they were limited, or what are their rights, even intuitively understanding their own rights? What is your take on that?
Well, I think when I think about, I think we don't know the answer to that completely, because and there's this long-term concern now that we have, and we're kind of waiting to see what the impact will be down the road for these children. Now, we do know that some children in Toronto never left their apartment for a year, right? They basically were in isolation for a long period of time during a critical part of their development. And so some pediatricians have already noticed, you know, children at age 2, you know, with very poor language ability, very poor social skills. So we're already starting to see the impact of this, and we don't know what the outcome will be and what it will look like globally either. We do know that in Ontario, we had way too many days of lockdown, way too many restrictions. And so, you know, that's another thing to look for. You know, how did other parts of the world, like the Netherlands, for example, keep their schools open? I mean, how did some of them seem to manage even, you know, their own outbreaks? And so we really don't know. I think the verdict is still out, but we are seeing some negative outcomes.
Yeah, I think about that part, but I was asking more about the perception of the children themselves as agents that can do things. So I'm wondering, how will they vote when they're able to vote 10 years from now? How that experience might have influenced them? How did they perceive government as a child, and how will that shape their personality and their understanding of voting and taking charge of things that they cannot do now?
Right.
I wish they had rights to vote or influence. Many parents at this election ask their children what to vote for, or I know that also there was parallel election in Germany. My sister asked her daughter what she should vote for, because children became so much more centered, and I wonder if that has an impact in the children as adults, as citizens.
Right. No, I understand what you're asking. You're asking for their perspectives down the road as well. I think we're going to see, the reason why I think there's an attenuation to this issue now is because children were able to talk about collectivism, shared responsibility, the importance of everybody pitching in. And I think this type of experience is going to leave a mark for sure. I don't see this going away, because it was done, it happened in such a profound way in terms of affecting every part of their life. Yeah. So you can't see them easily forgetting this, particularly school-age children who are going to have a better memory. Yeah. Right. So yeah, I mean, I think the verdict is still out, but I think that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Are there any final questions, just while anyone raises their hand or types it out? Oh, it looks like we have someone who's unmuted themselves. Gear, did you have something to add? Gear?
Yes, hi Donna. I was just, thank you very much.
Hi, Gare. Nice to see you.
No, nice being. I'm talking from Iceland. I was just when Ulla was talking about this. It's an interesting question. You see, COVID has had such a profound effect on all of us, including children, as you described. And I just also came to think about it. I mean, we had a profound economic crisis that you see here in Iceland, 2008. That is even difficult even for people like you in Canada to understand how profound it was. I mean, it was 3 banks, they just collapsed in 96% of the bank system. It was a terrible thing. And more or less, we were not maybe focusing on, I don't know really how children experienced. We know about it in the schools. They were yes, depressive, etc. But today, when I ask my students who are 20 years old, they hardly remember. So I'm linking to what you all were talking about. I don't know what is the impact. How did they take this in? Because they seem to have been left out in that they do not take it evidently. I mean, this crisis. Okay, no, they don't remember. I was linking to what you said, Ulla. So I wonder how they will take this further.
Yeah, and I don't think we know yet.
No, we definitely don't know yet, but I guess this will just be past memory, but maybe on a very, profound level, psychological level, mental health level, we are maybe seeing that impact coming. I don't know, but just a reflection. Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Maxime.
Thank you, Gare. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so it's 12:58 and I want to make sure that we have time to wrap up. There's one more hand up. Deb, do you have a quick comment to make?
Just that I'm just regarding the last question of how will kids be impacted. It seems to me it's going to really depend on what age they are at now and their developmental stage. And, for a lot of kids, that'll just be what their normal was growing up. I remember after the Ochre crisis, 15 years after the Ochre crisis in Quebec, and teenagers are saying, oh yeah, my mom and dad told me about that. Like, it was amazing, right? That was just, so it's really going to depend on what age they are, seems to me.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I think the school age kids are probably not going to forget.
Okay, well, on that note, I just wanted to say thank you very much, everyone, for attending, for taking time out of your day. And a big thank you to Donna and Max. That was really fascinating, really great webinar, and we will post it on our website soon.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody.